Call security! There's a black swindler in my ballroom!
Catherine Ashford's voice boomed. 500 guests turned.
Ma'am, I was invited.
Blake mumbled.
Invited? Who would invite a filthy black man from the slums?
A cheap suit doesn't make him one of us.
Please ask your staff.
Shut up!
She shoved him. He stumbled. She grabbed a glass of Bordeaux and splashed it in his face. The hall murmured in astonishment. Blake stood still. Wine dripped from his forehead, wetting his collar. He said nothing. A guest scoffed.
Check his pockets.
Laughter erupted. No one came to his defense. She yelled at the security.
Get him out! He's ruining my billion-dollar party!
She smirked. But she didn't know that her actions had just cost her the $1 billion she was celebrating. Have you ever watched a racist bully lose everything in front of the same crowd she humiliated someone in because you are about to sow comment, satisfying? And like this video, let me take you back to the beginning. 6 hours before the wine hit his face, Blake Irving was sitting alone in his penthouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. No butler, no personal chef, just a man in a plain gray t-shirt, drinking black coffee and reading a quarterly earnings report on his tablet. The penthouse was modest by billionaire standards. Clean lines, a single bookshelf filled with biographies of people who built things from nothing. On the kitchen counter sat a framed photograph, a woman in a nurse's uniform smiling with tired eyes. His mother, Gloria Irving. Gloria raised Blake and his younger sister on the south side of Chicago. She worked 3 jobs, night shifts, at a hospital, morning shifts, at a dry cleaner, weekends at a grocery store. Some nights she came home so exhausted, she fell asleep at the kitchen table with her shoes still on. But every morning, she made sure Blake had a clean shirt, a packed lunch, and 1 sentence before he walked out the door. Nobody can take what's in your head, baby. That's yours forever. Blake took that seriously. He studied finance at the public library because his school didn't offer it. He read annual reports the way other kids read comic books. By 19, he'd earned a full scholarship to Wharton. By 28, he'd launched Irving Capital Partners from a rented office above a laundromat in Philadelphia. By 45, his firm managed over $12 billion in assets. Forbes had profiled him twice. Bloomberg called him the quietest force on Wall Street. But Blake never changed. He still wore off-the-rack suits, still flew commercial when he could, still answered his own phone. He believed that if people treated you differently because of what you wore or what you drove, that told you everything you needed to know about them. Tonight he was about to test that belief. 300 miles away, in a corner office at Ashford Pharmaceuticals, headquarters in Hartford, Connecticut, Catherine Ashford was having her makeup done. Catherine was 52, third-generation CEO. Her grandfather had founded the company in 1961. Her father, Harold, now 78 and serving as honorary chairman, had expanded it into a mid-cap pharmaceutical giant, worth over $2 billion at its peak. Catherine had inherited the title 6 years ago, and under her leadership, the company had lost nearly half its value. Bad acquisitions, recalled products, 3 wrongful termination lawsuits, all filed by employees of color, all quietly settled out of court. The details were buried, but the pattern was not. Now Ashford Pharmaceuticals was drowning, $800 million in debt. Credit lines frozen. The board had given Catherine 1 final quarter to find a solution or face removal. That solution had arrived 4 months ago in the form of Raymond Wells. Raymond was 48, the company's CFO, and the only executive Catherine hadn't managed to alienate. He was calm where she was volatile diplomatic, where she was blunt, and he had spent the last 16 weeks negotiating the deal that would save everything. Irving Capital Partners had agreed to acquire Ashford Pharmaceuticals for $1 billion. The terms were generous. Blake had reviewed the company's pipeline, seen potential in 3 promising drug candidates, and decided the investment was worth the risk on one condition. He wanted to meet the full leadership team in person before closing. Raymond had agreed immediately. Catherine had not. "Why do I need to shake hands with some fund manager?" she'd asked, scrolling through her phone without looking up. "Because he's the one writing the check," Raymond said carefully. "Fine. Invite him to the gala. I'll say hello if I have time." She never asked for a name, never asked for a photo, never asked for a biography. To Catherine, the money mattered. The man behind it did not. Tonight was the gala. 500 guests at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. Black tie, champagne towers, a string quartet playing Vivaldi in the lobby. The event was billed as a charity fundraiser, but everyone in the room knew the real purpose: celebrating the billion-dollar deal that would pull Ashford Pharmaceuticals back from the edge. Blake Irving had received his invitation 3 weeks ago. He'd RSVP'd with a simple yes, no entourage, no publicist, no advance team. He put on a dark navy suit, off the rack as usual, knotted a simple tie, and took a cab to the plaza. He walked in alone, and no one in that room had any idea who he was. The Plaza Hotel lobby smelled like white orchids and old money. Marble floors reflected the warm glow of chandeliers that had hung there for over a century. Waiters in pressed white jackets moved through the crowd with silver trays, champagne caviar, tiny squares of smoked salmon on toast points. Blake stepped through the entrance and scanned the room. 500 guests, maybe more, men in tuxedos, women in gowns that cost more than some people's annual salaries. Diamonds caught the light everywhere he looked. He adjusted his tie, a simple navy knot, against a white shirt and walked toward the main hall. He didn't stop to announce himself. He didn't look for someone to escort him. He just walked in the way he always did, calmly, quietly, like a man who had nothing to prove. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne flutes. Blake took one and nodded. "Thank you." The waiter nodded back. No issue, no second glance. But someone else was watching. Catherine Ashford stood near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by a cluster of board members and their wives. She wore a floor-length emerald gown, a diamond choker, that had belonged to her grandmother, and an expression that suggested she owned not just the room, but everyone in it. She noticed Blake the moment he entered, not because of anything he did, but because of what he looked like: a black man, in her ballroom, wearing a suit that clearly didn't come from a designer boutique. No cufflinks, no Rolex, no entourage. No one rushed to greet him. No one called his name. Catherine leaned toward the woman beside her, Judith Emerson, wife of a pharmaceutical distributor, the kind of woman who measured people by their handbag. "Who is that?" Catherine said, keeping her voice low but sharp. Judith squinted. "No idea. Maybe someone's plus one." "In that suit?" Catherine's lips tightened. "He looks like he walked in off the street." "You don't think he's one of the caterers?" Catherine didn't answer immediately. She watched Blake take a sip of champagne and look around the room with calm, unhurried eyes. There was something about his ease that irritated her, the way he stood, the way he moved, the way he didn't seem uncomfortable at all. "No," Catherine said slowly. "I think he's a con man." Judith's eyebrows went up. "A con man?" "Look at him." Catherine's voice sharpened. "He doesn't know anyone here. He's not networking. He's observing, studying the room. That's what they do. They walk into events like this, pretend they belong, and then they start working the crowd. Business cards, fake ventures, sob stories. I've seen it before." "Should we call security?" "Not yet." Catherine set her champagne glass down. "Let me handle this myself." She crossed the ballroom floor in long, deliberate strides. The crowd parted slightly as she passed. People always made room for Catherine. Whether out of respect or fear, no one was ever quite sure. Blake had just set his champagne glass on a high table near the east wall, when he heard the click of heels behind him. "Excuse me." He turned. A tall woman in an emerald gown was standing 3 feet away. Her posture was rigid. Her chin was lifted. Her eyes moved over him, the way a person might inspect something unclean on the bottom of their shoe. "Good evening," Blake said, offering a slight nod. "Beautiful event." "Who are you?" Catherine said. No pleasantries, no smile. "Blake Irving," he said calmly. "I was invited." "Invited by whom?" "I received an invitation through your company's office. I'm happy to show me what." Catherine took a step closer. Her perfume was aggressive, heavy, expensive, suffocating. "An invitation you printed off the internet. A name you pulled from a guest list someone leaked." Blake paused. He studied her face for a moment, not with anger, not with surprise, with the quiet recognition of someone who had seen this before. "Ma'am, I assure you, I'm a guest. I was personally invited." "Personally invited." Catherine repeated the words, like they tasted bad. She turned to a man standing nearby Gerald Price, Ashford's head of security. A thick-necked man in a dark suit, with an earpiece and a permanent scowl. "Gerald, check this man." Gerald stepped forward, shoulders squared. "Sir, can I see some identification?" Blake reached into his jacket and produced the invitation, a thick cream-colored card with gold lettering, the same card every guest in the room had received. Gerald looked at it, looked at Blake, looked back at the card. "This appears to be legitimate Ms. Ashford." Catherine snatched the card from Gerald's hand. She turned it over, read the name, read it again. "Blake Irving," she said flatly. The name meant nothing to her. She had never bothered to learn it. "I don't know this name." She handed the card back to Blake, not to him directly, but dropped it so it fluttered to the floor between them. "Anyone can steal an invitation. Anyone can forge a card." A small circle of onlookers had gathered by now. 2 women near the hors d'oeuvres table craned their necks to watch. A man in a pinstripe suit pulled out his phone and began filming. Nobody intervened. Nobody said, "Maybe check again." The silence was its own verdict. "I didn't steal anything," Blake said, bending down to pick up the card. His voice remained even, patient. He straightened his jacket and tucked the card back into his breast pocket. Catherine turned to the small crowd that had gathered. She raised her voice, not quite shouting, but loud enough to carry 3 tables deep. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this interruption. It appears we have an uninvited guest tonight." She glanced back at Blake. "It's unfortunate, but these things happen when you open your doors for charity. Not everyone who walks through them has honest intentions." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some guests looked uncomfortable. Most did not. A few nodded along as if Catherine were stating the obvious. "Gerald," Catherine said, without looking away from Blake, "move him to the back. Away from the main floor. Away from my guests. I don't want him near anyone important." "Ma'am, the invitation checks out." "I didn't ask for your opinion." Catherine's voice dropped to a hiss. "I'm telling you what to do. Move him. Now." Gerald hesitated. Then he turned to Blake with an apologetic expression that never quite reached his mouth. "Sir, if you wouldn't mind stepping this way." Blake looked at Gerald, then at Catherine, then at the room full of people who had just watched a black man get interrogated for the crime of attending a party he was invited to. No one said a word. No one stepped forward. The woman with the phone kept recording. A man 2 tables away whispered something to his wife, who smirked and shook her head. "Of course," Blake said quietly. "I'll move." He walked with Gerald toward the far corner of the ballroom, past the stage, past the string quartet, past the ice sculpture shaped like the Ashford Pharmaceuticals logo. He sat down at a small table near the service entrance, the kind of table reserved for people who weren't supposed to be seen. Gerald set a glass of water in front of him. "I'm sorry about this, sir." Blake picked up the glass. "Don't be. You're just doing your job." Gerald lingered for a moment, as if he wanted to say something more. Then he straightened his earpiece and walked back to his post. Blake sat alone. The sounds of the party continued around him: clinking glasses, polite laughter, the low hum of conversations about stock prices and vacation homes. No one came to check on him. No one stopped by to say hello. The table might as well have been invisible. From across the room, Catherine watched him with her arms crossed. She leaned toward Judith, who had followed the entire exchange with wide, eager eyes. "See," Catherine said. "He didn't fight it. He knows he doesn't belong." "What if he really was invited?" Judith asked cautiously. Catherine picked up a fresh glass of champagne and took a long sip. "Then someone made a mistake, and I just corrected it." She turned away and walked back toward the center of the room, where the stage was being prepared for her speech. In the far corner, Blake Irving sat perfectly still. He looked down at the water glass in his hand, then at the stain of champagne still on his fingers, from the glass Catherine's security had taken from him earlier. He didn't call anyone. He didn't pull out his phone. He didn't leave. He waited, because Blake Irving had learned something a long time ago from a woman who worked 3 jobs and fell asleep at the kitchen table with her shoes still on. Patience isn't weakness. Patience is knowing exactly when to move. And he wasn't ready to move yet. 20 minutes passed. Blake sat at the corner table near the service entrance and watched the party continue without him. He didn't touch the water. He didn't look at his phone. He just watched. From where he sat, he could see the stage being prepared. 2 technicians adjusted the microphone stand. A spotlight tested its angle. A banner behind the podium read, "Ashford Pharmaceuticals, building the future together." Together. Blake almost smiled at that. At exactly 8:15, the string quartet stopped. The ballroom lights dimmed. A single spotlight hit the center of the stage, and Catherine Ashford walked up the steps with the confidence of a woman who had never been told no. She looked radiant. The emerald gown caught the light. The diamond choker sparkled against her collarbone. She gripped the podium with both hands and looked out at the sea of 500 faces: donors, executives, politicians, socialites, all waiting to hear the speech that would mark the beginning of Ashford Pharmaceuticals' new chapter. "Good evening, everyone." Her voice was warm now, practiced. The sharp edges she'd shown Blake were gone, tucked away behind a media-trained smile. "Thank you for being here tonight. This event means more to me than I can express." She paused for effect. "As many of you know, Ashford Pharmaceuticals has been through a challenging period. We faced setbacks. We faced doubt. There were moments when I wasn't sure we would make it through." A murmur of sympathy from the crowd. "But tonight I stand before you with extraordinary news." Catherine's voice lifted. "We have secured a $1 billion acquisition deal with a major investment firm that believes in our vision, our science, and our future." Applause. Loud, sustained, enthusiastic. Champagne glasses raised. People at the front tables stood. Catherine soaked it in. She gripped the podium a little tighter, the way people do when they want to make sure everyone knows who's in charge. "This deal is the result of months of hard work, my hard work, my team's dedication, and the unwavering commitment of the Ashford family to excellence in healthcare." More applause. Catherine smiled. She owned this moment. She had rehearsed this speech 4 times in front of a mirror, and every word landed exactly where she wanted it to. "I want to personally thank everyone in this room who stood by us during the difficult times. Your loyalty will not be forgotten." She scanned the room. Her eyes moved past the VIP tables, past the champagne towers, past the ice sculpture, and landed on Blake Irving. He was still sitting at the corner table, alone, a glass of untouched water in front of him, his wine-free shirt a quiet reminder that he hadn't been offered a proper drink since being exiled to the back of the room. Catherine's jaw tightened. He was still here. She'd told Gerald to move him. She hadn't told Gerald to let him stay. The fact that this man, this uninvited, unwelcome intruder, was still in her ballroom, still sitting there, with that calm expression on his face, still breathing her air and occupying her space. It was unacceptable. She stepped away from the podium. "Excuse me for one moment," she said into the microphone, her voice still sweet. "I need to address a small housekeeping matter." A few guests chuckled politely. Catherine walked down the stage steps and crossed the ballroom. Her heels clicked against the marble in a rhythm that silenced conversations as she passed. People turned to watch. Phones came out. Someone near the bar opened Instagram and hit the live button. Blake saw her coming. He didn't stand up. He didn't look away. He sat exactly where he was, hands folded on the table, and watched her approach with the same quiet patience he'd shown all evening. Catherine stopped in front of his table. "I thought I told security to remove you." "They asked me to sit here," Blake said evenly. "I've been sitting here." "You should have left." "I was invited, ma'am. I have every right to be here." Catherine's nostrils flared. Her chest rose. The composure she'd worn on stage was cracking piece by piece. Every right. She leaned forward, palms flat on the table. "You have no right. You have no name. You have nothing. You are nothing." Blake said nothing. "I know what you are." Catherine continued, her voice rising. Guests at nearby tables stopped their conversations. Forks paused midair. "You're a fraud, a con artist. You walked in here with a stolen invitation and a cheap suit, and you think you can sit among people who actually earn their place in this world." A man at the next table muttered to his wife, "She's right. He doesn't look like he belongs." The wife nodded. "Probably got in through the service entrance." Their words carried. Blake heard every syllable. His jaw tightened, just barely, just for a second. But he said nothing. Catherine saw the flicker and pressed harder. "What's the matter? Nothing to say. No clever lie. No fake business card." She turned to the crowd with her arms spread. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is what happens when you open your doors too wide. The trash walks in." Scattered laughter. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to fill the silence with something worse than cruelty agreement. Still nothing. Blake looked at her, steady, unblinking. That silence, that absolute refusal to react, was the thing that pushed Catherine Ashford past the point of no return. "Answer me," she shouted. The ballroom went quiet. 500 people held their breath. Blake opened his mouth. "Ma'am, if you would just—" Catherine grabbed the glass of Bordeaux from the table behind her and poured it over Blake's head. The wine hit him like a slow-motion catastrophe. It ran down his forehead, stung his eyes, dripped from his chin, soaked through his white collar, pooled in the creases of his jacket. Red on white, like a stain that would never wash out. The ballroom gasped. Catherine wasn't finished. "You people never learn," she hissed loud enough for the nearest 20 tables to hear. "You don't belong here. You will never belong here. And if you think a stolen invitation makes you one of us, you're even more pathetic than you look." She grabbed a napkin from the table and threw it at his chest. "Clean yourself up. You're disgusting." An older woman at the VIP table turned to her husband. "Can you believe he's still standing there?" "Shameless," the husband replied, adjusting his cufflinks. "Absolutely shameless." Blake caught the napkin. Wine dripped from his eyebrows. His shirt was ruined. His jacket was stained. But his hands were steady. He didn't wipe his face, not yet. He looked at Catherine, then at the 500 guests, then at the phones recording from every angle, then at the couple who had just called him shameless, then back at Catherine. And he smiled. Not a grin, not a smirk. A small, quiet smile, the kind that said, "I see you. I see all of you. And you have no idea what's coming." Catherine frowned. The smile unsettled her. It wasn't the reaction she expected. She'd expected shame, fear, retreat. Instead, she got calm certainty. "What are you smiling at?" she snapped. Blake didn't answer. He set the napkin on the table, wiped the wine from his eyes with the back of his hand, straightened his soaked collar. Then he reached into his jacket pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his phone. Blake dialed a number. 1 ring, 2 rings. "It's Blake," he said. His voice was steady. No anger, no tremor. Just 4 words. "Pull the deal. Now." He ended the call, slipped the phone back into his pocket. Somewhere on the 42nd floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan, Blake's chief counsel opened a laptop and began drafting an email. The subject line read, "Termination of acquisition agreement effective immediately." At 8:47 p.m., that email landed in the inbox of every member of Ashford Pharmaceuticals' legal team board of directors and executive committee. Raymond Wells was on the 3rd floor of the plaza finishing a call with a European distributor when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the notification, read the subject line, read it again. His face went white. He dropped the phone on the bathroom counter and ran down the hallway, past the elevators, through the service corridor. He burst through the ballroom doors and scanned the room with wild, desperate eyes. He saw Catherine standing near the stage, still smiling, still basking in the glow of her own speech. And he saw Blake Irving sitting at a corner table, wine dripping from his collar, looking at the ceiling with the patience of a man who had already won. Raymond's legs nearly gave out, because he knew something that Catherine didn't. He knew exactly who Blake Irving was. And he knew that the billion-dollar deal, the only thing standing between Ashford Pharmaceuticals and total collapse, had just been canceled by the man Catherine Ashford had publicly humiliated in front of 500 witnesses. Raymond pushed through the crowd. He bumped into a waiter carrying a tray of champagne. Glasses shattered on the marble floor. He didn't stop. He didn't apologize. He just kept moving past the VIP tables, past the ice sculpture, past the guests who turned to stare at the CFO of Ashford Pharmaceuticals, running through a black tie gala, like a man whose house was on fire. Because it was. Catherine was standing near the stage, talking to Judith Emerson, still riding the high of her speech and her public takedown of the intruder. She was laughing about something, probably Blake, when Raymond grabbed her arm. "Catherine." His voice was barely a whisper, but his grip said everything. "We need to talk, right now." "Raymond, I'm in the middle of bore. Right now." Something in his eyes made her stop. She'd known Raymond for 12 years. She'd never seen him look like this. His face was the color of paper. His hands were trembling. A vein in his temple pulsed visibly. She followed him to the side of the stage, just behind the curtain. Out of the spotlight, but not out of earshot. The wireless microphone on the podium was still on. Neither of them noticed. "What is it?" Catherine said impatiently. "You're making a scene." "The man you just poured wine on," Raymond's voice cracked. "Do you know who he is? Some con artist who snuck in. I handled it." "You didn't handle it." Raymond pressed his palms against his forehead. "You just destroyed us." Catherine blinked. "Excuse me. That man, the man sitting in the corner with wine running down his face, is Blake Irving." Silence. "Blake Irving." Raymond repeated slower this time, as if saying the name clearly enough might undo what had happened. "Founder and CEO of Irving Capital Partners. The man who signed our billion-dollar deal. The man whose signature is on page 31 of the acquisition agreement that's sitting in your office right now. That man. The one you just called trash in front of 500 people." Catherine's mouth opened. No words came out. The wireless microphone caught every syllable. Raymond's voice, raw, desperate, breaking, echoed through the ballroom speakers. 500 guests heard it all. That man is Blake Irving. He signed our billion-dollar deal, the one you just called trash. The ballroom went silent, not the polite, respectful silence of a speech. The suffocating silence of 500 people realizing they had just witnessed something catastrophic. Every head in the room turned toward the corner table. Blake Irving was still sitting there, wine still on his collar, water glass still untouched. He looked up, not at Catherine, not at Raymond, but at the room itself. At the 500 faces now staring at him, with a mixture of shock horror and the slow dawning recognition that they had been watching the wrong person all night. Catherine's legs buckled. She grabbed the edge of the curtain to steady herself. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no. That's not Raymond. That's not possible. He doesn't look like—" She stopped herself, but the sentence hung in the air, unfinished for everyone to hear. He doesn't look like what Catherine the question was on every face in the room. No one needed to say it out loud. Blake stood up from the corner table. He buttoned his stained jacket, slowly, methodically, and walked toward the center of the ballroom. The crowd parted. Not the way they parted for Catherine, not out of power or fear. They parted out of something else entirely, something closer to shame. He stopped in front of the stage, looked up at Catherine, who was still clutching the curtain mascara, beginning to run down her left cheek. "Mrs. Ashford." His voice was calm, clear. It carried across the silent room without effort. "I came here tonight because I wanted to meet the leadership team of the company I was about to invest $1 billion in. I wanted to see the culture, the values, the people." He paused. "I've seen enough." Catherine opened her mouth. "Mr. Irving, please. I didn't know if I had known who you—" "That's exactly the problem, Mrs. Ashford." Blake's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with basic decency. You didn't need to know my net worth to offer me the respect you give every other person in this room. But you saw my skin, and you decided I was nothing." He looked around the room, at the phones still recording, at the faces frozen in guilt, at the couple who had called him shameless, at the woman who had laughed when Catherine said, "The trash walks in." "I hope you all remember this night," he said, "not because of what she did to me, but because not one of you stopped her." He turned back to Catherine. "The deal is canceled. My legal team sent the termination notice 6 minutes ago. Your board, your investors, and your legal counsel have already been notified." Catherine's knees gave way. She sank onto the stage steps. The diamond choker suddenly looked absurd, a fortune around the neck of a woman who had just lost everything. "Please," she whispered, "please, we can talk about this." Blake looked at her for a long moment. Then he straightened his tie, the same simple navy knot he'd been wearing all evening, and turned toward the door. His shoes clicked against the marble floor. Each step echoed through the silence. 500 people watched him walk away, and not a single one of them said a word. The ballroom doors closed behind him with a soft thud. And then nothing. Just the hum of the air conditioning and the quiet sound of Catherine Ashford's world falling apart. Catherine ran. She kicked off her heels at the edge of the stage and sprinted barefoot across the marble floor. The emerald gown caught on a chair leg. She didn't stop. She tore through the ballroom doors and into the hallway, her diamond choker swinging wildly against her chest. "Mr. Irving, please wait." Blake was standing at the elevator. His finger had already pressed the button. The doors were opening. Catherine reached him just as he stepped inside. "Please." She was breathless. Her mascara had smeared into dark streaks under both eyes. Her hair, which had been pinned in a perfect updo 30 minutes ago, was falling apart. "Please, you don't understand. I didn't know who you were. If I had known—" Blake held the elevator door open with one hand. He looked at her, not with anger, not with satisfaction, with something worse, disappointment. "That's exactly what I'm talking about, Mrs. Ashford." His voice was quiet, almost gentle. "You keep saying, 'if I had known,' but that's the point. You shouldn't have needed to know. I could have been a janitor, a waiter, a cab driver, and I still wouldn't have deserved what you did tonight." Catherine's chin trembled. "I'll fix this. I'll make a public apology. I'll—" "You poured wine on a man's head because of the color of his skin, in front of 500 people, on camera." Blake let the words land one at a time. "There's no fixing that." He stepped back into the elevator. Catherine lunged forward, grabbing the door with both hands. "The deal," she whispered. "Please. Without the deal, we're finished. The company, my family's company, it's all we have." Blake looked at her hands, gripping the elevator door. Then at her face. Then at the hallway behind her, where a small group of guests had gathered to watch the CEO of Ashford Pharmaceuticals beg a man she'd called trash 10 minutes earlier. "You should have thought about that before you decided what I was worth based on what I look like." He gently removed her hands from the door. The elevator closed. Catherine stood in the hallway, barefoot, staring at her own reflection in the polished steel. Behind her, the whispers had already started. Inside the ballroom chaos, the 500 guests who had witnessed Blake's departure were no longer celebrating. Conversations erupted at every table. Some people were shouting. Others were already on their phones calling lawyers, calling partners, calling anyone who could explain what had just happened. Gerald Price, the head of security, stood near the entrance with his arms at his sides, staring at the floor. He'd known something was wrong the moment he checked Blake's invitation. He'd told Catherine it was legitimate. She hadn't listened. At the bar, the bartender was replaying the Instagram live stream on his phone. It had already been shared 1,400 times. The comments were pouring in faster than he could scroll. Did she really just do that? That woman needs to be fired. Who is Blake Irving? Somebody get this man a crown. Ashford Pharmaceuticals is done. By 9:15 p.m., less than 30 minutes after the wine hit Blake's face, the video had crossed 200,000 views. By midnight, it would hit 2 million. Raymond Wells sat alone in the ballroom at the same corner table where Blake had been exiled. The irony wasn't lost on him. He stared at his phone, scrolling through the termination email, reading each clause, with the slow precision of a man watching a building collapse floor by floor. His phone rang. The chairman of the board, Harold Ashford, Catherine's own father. "Raymond." Harold's voice was ice, 78 years old and still sharper than anyone in the company. "Tell me what happened," Raymond told him. The line went silent for 11 seconds. Raymond counted everyone. "I'll be in New York by morning," Harold said. Then he hung up. At 10 p.m., the after-hours trading desk lit up. Ashford Pharmaceuticals stock, which had closed at $42.30 that afternoon on optimism about the acquisition, began falling, first slowly, then in waves. Sell orders cascaded through the system like dominoes. By midnight, the stock had dropped to $25.80. 40% of the company's market value, roughly $600 million, had evaporated in 3 hours. Raymond picked up his glass of water from the corner table, the same glass Gerald had set in front of Blake earlier that evening. He drank it, set it down, and typed his resignation letter on his phone. He sent it at 12:01 a.m. Subject line, effective immediately. By sunrise, the story had escaped the ballroom and entered the bloodstream of America. The Instagram live video, all 11 minutes and 43 seconds of it, had been downloaded, re-uploaded, screen recorded, clipped, captioned, and shared across every platform on the internet. Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube. By 6 a.m., the original clip had crossed 15 million views. By noon, it hit 50 million. The hashtags wrote themselves. Hashtag boycott Ashford, hashtag justice for Blake, hashtag billion-dollar mistake, hashtag wine on his head. They trended not just nationally but globally. In London and Lagos, in Sao Paulo and Tokyo, people who had never heard of Ashford Pharmaceuticals were watching a woman in an emerald gown pour wine on a black man's head and call him trash. The news networks followed within hours. CNN ran the clip at 7 a.m. with the headline, CEO humiliates black billionaire at gala loses $1 billion. Deal on the spot. The anchor shook her head on camera. I've been in this business for 20 years, she said, and I've never seen someone destroy their own company in real time. NBC's morning show dedicated an entire segment to the incident. They played the clip 3 times. They played Raymond's voice through the microphone. That man is Blake Irving. He signed our billion-dollar deal. And the studio went quiet. Fox News framed it as a corporate governance failure. This isn't just about racism, the commentator said. This is about a CEO who didn't even know who saved her company. That's incompetence at every level. MSNBC brought in a civil rights attorney who called the incident one of the most public displays of racial discrimination in corporate America in the last decade. By mid-morning, the pressure was coming from every direction. Ashford Pharmaceuticals' 3 largest retail partners, CVS, Walgreens, and Rite Aid, issued a joint statement. We are deeply disturbed by the events at last night's gala. We are reviewing our partnership with Ashford Pharmaceuticals and will make further decisions based on the company's response. 2 major hospital networks announced they were suspending orders of Ashford products pending an internal review. A group of 63 Ashford employees, the majority of them people of color, signed an open letter demanding Catherine's immediate removal. The letter was published in the New York Times by noon. The stock continued to fall. By the close of trading on the day after the gala, Ashford Pharmaceuticals had lost 40% of its market value. $600 million. Gone. Not because of a bad drug trial. Not because of a manufacturing recall. Because of one woman, one glass of wine, and one decision rooted in nothing but contempt. At 2 p.m., a Blacktown car pulled up to the Ashford Pharmaceuticals headquarters in Hartford, Connecticut. Harold Ashford, 78 years old, honorary chairman. The man who had built this company into a $2 billion enterprise stepped out with the help of a cane and the weight of a legacy crumbling around him. He didn't speak to the press gathered outside. He didn't acknowledge the protesters who had been there since dawn, holding signs that read, Ashford equals racism and Catherine must go. He walked straight into the boardroom. Grant Ashford, Catherine's older brother, 55, a quiet man who had spent his career running Ashford's European division, was already seated at the table. So were the remaining 7 members of the board of directors. Catherine sat at the head of the table. Her eyes were swollen. She hadn't slept. She was wearing the same emerald gown from the night before she hadn't gone home. She'd spent the night in her office, watching the video play on loop on her laptop, reading the comments, reading the letters, reading the emails from partners pulling out one by one. Harold sat down across from her. He placed his cane against the table. He looked at his daughter for a long time. Catherine, he said. His voice was quiet, controlled, but there was a tremor beneath it, the kind that comes not from age, but from grief. Do you understand what you've done? Dad, Do you understand? He repeated, what you've done to this family, to the name your grandfather built, to everything we've spent 60 years protecting. Catherine said nothing. Harold turned to the board. I'm calling for an emergency vote. Motion to remove Catherine Ashford as CEO, effective immediately. Motion to revoke her equity stake in the family trust. motioned to strike her name from the Ashford Foundation. Grant seconded every motion without hesitation. The vote was unanimous, 9-0. Catherine stared at the table. Her hands were flat on the polished wood, the same posture she'd used the night before when she leaned over Blake Irving's table and told him he was nothing. "You're my father," she whispered. Harold stood up. He picked up his cane. He looked at her one last time. "You stopped being my daughter the moment you poured that wine." He walked out of the boardroom. Grant followed. The board members filed out one by one. No one looked back. Catherine sat alone in the empty room, the same way Blake had sat alone at the corner table the night before. The press conference was held at 4 p.m. Harold Ashford stood behind a podium, flanked by Grant and the board. His statement was brief. "The actions of Catherine Ashford do not represent this family, this company, or the values upon which Ashford Pharmaceuticals was founded. She has been removed from all positions within the organization. Her involvement with the Ashford Family Trust has been terminated. We extend our deepest apologies to Mr. Blake Irving and to every person who was hurt by what happened last night." When asked if Catherine would face legal consequences, Harold simply said, "That is not up to us. That is up to the law." And the law was already moving. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission announced a formal investigation into Ashford Pharmaceuticals' workplace practices. Within 48 hours, 14 former employees, all people of color, had come forward with allegations of discrimination, harassment, and wrongful termination under Catherine's leadership. 3 of them had signed settlements with non-disclosure agreements. Those agreements were now being challenged in court. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles from Hartford, Blake Irving was sitting in a conference room in Chicago. Across the table sat Dr. Simone Carter, 38 years old, a biochemist, and the founder of a small startup called Horizon Therapeutics. Simone's company had developed a breakthrough generic medication for type 2 diabetes, effective, affordable, and designed specifically for underserved communities that had been priced out of existing treatments. She had the science, she had the FDA pathway. What she didn't have was funding. Blake slid a single sheet of paper across the table. $1 billion, he said. Full investment, no strings. Build what you came here to build. Simone looked at the paper, then at Blake. Her eyes filled with tears. "Why?" she asked. Blake leaned back in his chair. He thought about his mother, about the kitchen table, about the shoes she never took off. "Because someone once told me that what's in your head is the only thing nobody can take from you." He smiled. "And you've got something extraordinary in yours." They shook hands. The $1 billion that was supposed to save Ashford Pharmaceuticals went somewhere else entirely. Somewhere better. 6 months later, Horizon Therapeutics received FDA approval for its first drug, a generic diabetes medication that cost patients $12 a month instead of $300. The announcement made the front page of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and every major health publication in the country. Blake Irving and Dr. Simone Carter stood side by side on the cover of Forbes. The headline read, "The $1 billion bet that changed healthcare." Inside the article, Simone described the moment Blake slid the investment offer across the table. "I've pitched to 42 investors over 3 years," she said. "Every single one wanted to change my formula to make it more profitable." Blake was the first person who said, "Build what you came here to build." He didn't want to change the drug. He wanted to change the system. Within 3 months of launch, Horizon's medication reached 400,000 patients across 12 states, primarily in low-income communities, where diabetes rates were highest and treatment options were fewest. Clinics in the south side of Chicago, the Bronx, rural Mississippi, and East Los Angeles began stocking the drug. Waiting lists disappeared. Emergency room visits for diabetes complications dropped by 31% in the communities Horizon served. The company's valuation climbed to $2 billion. Blake didn't take a single interview about the money. When reporters asked about the gala, about the wine, about Catherine Ashford, he gave the same answer every time. That night isn't my story. This is. But Catherine Ashford's story had a different ending. She was living in a one-bedroom apartment in Stamford, Connecticut, a 40-minute train ride from the Hartford headquarters she used to run. The emerald gown hung in a closet she never opened. The diamond choker had been sold to cover legal fees. The EEOC investigation had resulted in a formal finding of discriminatory practices under her leadership. 17 former employees received settlements. Catherine herself faced a civil lawsuit filed by the NAACP on behalf of employees who had been denied promotions, underpaid, or terminated based on race during her 6 years as CEO. Her social media accounts had been deleted, not by hackers, by herself. She couldn't bear to read the comments anymore. The hashtags had faded from trending, but the video hadn't disappeared. It lived on YouTube with over 90 million views. It was used in corporate diversity training programs across the country. Business schools at Harvard, Wharton, and Stanford included it in their ethics curricula as a case study in leadership failure. Catherine's name had become a verb in corporate circles. Don't pull a Catherine Ashford meant don't let your prejudice cost you everything. Her father hadn't spoken to her since the boardroom vote. Neither had Grant. The Ashford family had released one final statement 3 months after the gala. Catherine Ashford is no longer affiliated with the Ashford family in any business, philanthropic, or personal capacity. She was alone. On a Tuesday evening in March, Catherine was sitting in her apartment watching the evening news. A segment came on Blake Irving delivering the keynote address at the National Medical Conference in Washington, D.C. She reached for the remote to change the channel, but she didn't press the button. Blake stood at the podium. No emerald gown, no diamond choker, no champagne towers, just a man in a simple navy suit and a quiet voice that carried. I didn't cancel that deal because someone poured wine on me, he said. I've had worse. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I know what it feels like to be told you don't belong. He paused. I canceled that deal because I refuse to build empires with people who can't see humanity in others. Money isn't the measure of a person. Character is. And character is what you show when you think nobody important is watching. The audience rose to their feet. Standing ovation. 3,000 people. Catherine turned off the television. She sat in the dark for a long time. The following weekend, Blake visited Southside Chicago. He walked through the neighborhood where he grew up, past the laundromat, past the library where he'd taught himself to read financial statements, past the apartment building where Gloria Irving had fallen asleep at the kitchen table with her shoes still on. He stopped at his old high school, sat down with the principal, and signed a check for $10 million, a scholarship fund for students of color pursuing careers in science, medicine, and finance. The principal asked him what he wanted the fund to be called. Blake thought for a moment, then he smiled. The Gloria Irving Fund. Because some people leave you money, and some people leave you something worth more. So here's my question for you, and I really want to know. What would you have done if you were standing in that ballroom? Would you have stayed silent like everyone else? Or would you have been the one person who stood up? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. If this story hit you the way it hit me, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're not subscribed, yet you know what to do. Hashtag justice. For Blake, hashtag never judge. Hashtag $1 billion. Lesson, hashtag Gloria Irving Fund.
You know what's the ugliest thing in the world? Respect that only shows up after you find out someone is important. That's not respect. That's a fear wearing a mask. Real respect doesn't need a reason. It doesn't check your bank account. It doesn't wait to see your title before it decides how to treat you. It just sees the person and says, "You're human." That's enough. And most people don't work that way. They're doing math. What can this person do for me? What are they worth? And if the answer is nothing, they treat them like nothing. Then the second that answer changes, suddenly they are kind, suddenly they're sorry, suddenly they want to be your best friend. But you didn't change, they didn't change either. They just update their mouth. And that's the loneliest thing in the world, knowing someone's kindness has a price tag on it. Knowing that if you sold out in different shoes, they wouldn't even look at you. So, be the person who looks. Be the person whose kindness doesn't have the conditions. Not because you don't know who someone might be, because it shouldn't matter. Like, share, and subscribe. Real stories, real updates every week. And remember, if your respect disappears the moment someone looks like they have nothing, it was never respect, just math.